story, there was a woman who owned a large herd of cattle, and she loved those cattle, not only because she had reared every single one, watched their births, and helped in their births with some cases, but also because those cattle were her livelihood. She knew she wouldn't eat and wouldn't be able to stay on that farm without them, as the same with her neighbors and their herds of cattle and their neighbors, and the whole village relied on these herds of cattle. Until one day, cows became sickly. And it was unlike any kind of pestilence that they'd ever seen in a cow before. The cows suddenly, they would wake up one morning and the woman's prized cows heaved and was having trouble breathing. The next day it began to shake and twitch. And by the third morning, she woke up and she looked outside and she saw her prized cow with its legs sticking straight up into the air. And its head was lolled over to the side, and it had its tongue sticking out of its face, and its cow eyes just staring up into the sky. And you might wonder how I know how a cow sticks its legs not just straight up like this, but out to the side. That's another story about dead cows for another time. We can talk about that at cookies afterwards. But those cow legs were just sticking straight up, and she saw her pride. My prized cow, what am I going to do? Oh. And she saw as day after day, cow after cow, began to collapse and fall with its legs, what? Bing! Straight up, thank you. Into the sky. What am I going to do? She saw her neighbor's cows doing the same thing. And they tried everything. They would set fires, and they would take the carcasses of those cattle and fling them onto the fires to try and burn away the pestilence. That didn't work. And so they went to the vicar. They got holy water from the vicar, and they would sprinkle those cows with holy water. That didn't work either. And so finally, after several weeks of this pestilence, she decided she would resort to methods that weren't often taken by people in the village. She went to seek out the wise people who lived in the woods, to see what they would say. So she bundled herself up one night, she wrapped her shawl around her, and she went out into those woods. There was a mist. It was cold. She picked her way through those woods until she found the caravan, and she found the wise woman, and she went and she told the wise woman what had happened in their village, and she sought that wise woman's help. And the woman, she smiled. She knew, no, there is no pestilence that's preying on your cattle, no. And this is something that no holy water can fix, no. You need something much stronger. There's an evil spirit that's feeding on the flesh of those cattle, and you must have the death breed to solve it. The woman looked at me like, the woman looked at that woman like you all are looking at her. The death breed? Hi, the breed. You mean a death brew, a breed? A brew, a death breed. You get the death breed, and this is how you retrieve the breed. You go to a cemetery at midnight, a churchyard, and you go dig up a body, and you take the head, the soup that's sitting inside the head, that's the brie, the brew, the brie. And you take that brie and you feed it to those cattle, and that's what will cure and make that spirit go away. Well, she thanked the woman for her advice, and she left those woods and walked back, and as she walked back, she pondered all the ramifications of what would happen if she dug up a dead body. She knew that she risked being not only arrested, but killed and hung for such a crime. And moreover, she was worried about some kind of unholy retribution for digging up a dead body and disturbing the spirits. So she decided she just couldn't do it. But she woke up the next morning and looked out into her fields, and what do you think she saw? Bing! Not only in her field, but the neighbor's field. Bing! Everywhere, and day after day, until finally she decided there was no other way. She went to the neighboring woman. She said, "We've got to go." "You want me to go where and do what with the skull?" "We've got to. It's the only way. The wise woman in the woods, she's never lied. We've got to do it." "I don't know that I can do that." "You must." So she took that woman by the hand. They went and procured a shovel, and they waited until the sky became dark. Long about 10:30 or 11 o'clock at night, they went and they could see the lights were out in the vicarage. They knew the vicar was asleep. So they went past the kirk and they could see the kirkyard, the churchyard. There was a fence standing between them and those graves, and there was a gate in that fence. And so the woman went and her friend led on, and the friend, she put her hands on that gate and she looked out at those graves and she froze. And the woman told her, she said, open the gate. Open the gate. We've got to get the death free. And she froze. And she was so frozen, latched onto that gate, that it couldn't be moved. She just wouldn't move it. And so the woman, she took the shovel, she flung it over that fence, and she climbed over the fence herself. Picked up the shovel and she kept on walking. And she walked until she came to the first grave, and she looked at that grave, and she saw that there was grass growing up over that grave, and she thought that that grass would be difficult to dig through. It had clearly been a grave that had been sitting there in the ground settling for quite some time, and so, you're welcome, she didn't dig there. So she kept on walking. She saw there was another grave, and she saw that this grave too, it had grass growing up, and she thought that would be too difficult a task for just one night's work, and so she left that grave alone. You're welcome too. And on she went until she found a freshly dug grave. Sorry. And she thought, I could get my shovel in there. And so she saw that sod and those clumps of dirt. She thought it would be easy to push her shovel through that dirt. And so she set to work, and she got down 5 feet. She got down 6 feet, but still no body, because at that time in Scotland, the poor people could often only afford one plot for their entire family. And so they would dig the graves deep, and they would layer the bodies, stacking them one on top of the other, wrapped in linen cloths, because they could not afford a coffin. She kept on digging in that deep grave. She hit something squishy. And so she cleared away that dirt. She unwrapped those fresh linens, and she saw the face of a man. And she thought that probably that face was as peaceful in death as it had ever been in life. Well, she saw that because it was a fresh body, she saw that the head was firmly attached to the rest of the body, and she didn't want to take her shovel and detach the head because that was just too icky, but also because she was afraid she would disturb the death brie inside. But she thought if she could just use her legs. Her legs were strong, and she could just pop the head off. And so she laid down on the chest of that corpse. And she put one foot underneath the chin on one side. And she put another foot underneath the chin on the other side. And she thought in her head, maybe I could just push with my legs and I could pop that head right off. And so as she geared up to do just that and pushed her feet into position, right as she was about to push, she heard a voice. It's my head, leave it alone. She heard something. She didn't know where it had come from, but it sounded like it came from the direction of where the head was. And she got up very close, just face to face with that head. And right as she did, those eyes popped open again. I said, that's my head, leave it alone. There's something wrong with that body. And she moved it over to the side, but undeterred, she kept on digging. Something even squishier. And so she cleared that dirt away. She saw that the linens were deteriorating. And they were easy to tear and pull aside.
What on earth?
She heard a death rattle. Undeterred, she kept on peeling away those layers of linen. And she saw a face that had the flesh of it starting to fall away and melt away. It was half skull and half flesh. She saw that the head was only connected to the body with just a little bit of sinew. So she thought that with her arms, she'd have enough strength just to pop it off. And so as she reached down, she put one hand on one cheek, one hand on the other cheek, and she was about to lift it off when those eyes popped open and she heard a voice.
Oh, she's got lovely, soft, warm hands.
She heard another voice. That's my father. Leave him alone. She moved that body aside and she kept on digging. She hit bone. And she cleared all that dirt away. There were no linen wrappings left over this body. She saw the skeleton, and she saw at the top of that skeleton, she saw exactly what she needed. She saw the skull. But she was worried that that skull had been sitting in the ground for so long that brie inside, it might have all dried up. And so she looked inside the eye socket, and she saw there was plenty of ripe brie inside. It had been steeping for quite some time. And so just as she reached down, she thought she could easily lift up that head. It wasn't even attached with anything onto the rest of the skeleton, but as she reached down, she had to look back and reach back and lean back because that skull, it sat up with the rest of its torso. And as it sat up, it turned towards her and said, "What are you doing disturbing our sleep?" She said, "Well, I didn't just come here to pass the time down in this hole. We've had a time of it up above ground." And she told that skull all that had happened. He said, "I know what you're wanting. You be wanting the brie." And the other skulls, they also, the brie. They knew too, it was swimming around in their own heads. "Well, don't bother my grandson, and don't bother my son. But you can take my head under one condition. You have to bring my head back and reunite me with my body in this hole before the cock crows 3 times. If you don't, my soul will wander the earth forever. And guess who I'll be visiting often?" And she agreed. And so she took that skull, it allowed itself to be taken, and she tucked it underneath her shoulder, and she climbed out of that dark, deep hole. She came back over to the gate, and she saw that her friend had fainted, dead away. And the fainted girl was blocking the path of that gate, and so she had to climb back over the fence again, and she took that skull in one hand, and she took her friend by the other hand, and she dragged that friend over to the vicarage, and she left it at the vicar's door for the vicar to find her welcome. And on she walked. That was a burp, excuse me. And on she walked until she came to her own field, and she saw her cattle ailing. If you could see what death sees. What is it that death sees? Would you be dead and see it yourself? No, I wouldn't be dead, but I would be living and see as you see. The dead see how precious every breath the living do take is. The dead see the spirits of those who once lived and walk again among the living, standing on one side, standing on the other, the good and the bad. Death sees the evil that feeds on the flesh of these cattle. And this dead skull sees you don't have much more time before the cock crows 3 times. So she took that skull and she set to work. She went over to that first cow that was ailing. And she took that skull and she poured some of that death brie into that skull, that cow's mouth. And as she did, as it poured out of the eye socket, that really clears the sinuses. And she went over and she saw that cow, it stood up and it took a breath, a deep, long breath, the first good breath that it had, and many, many weeks.
The dead sea, how precious every breath. The animals and the living do take.
And on it walked. On they went to the next cow. And that cow was even sicker than the first. And so she took that skull and she leaned that skull down and she got it right up to that cow's mouth where the cow could just lick into the eye. Now don't you lick my skull. Don't worry. It's tempting, I know. That cow, it took its tongue and it licked inside the eye socket. And it, oh, that tickles. And as it did, that cow, it stood up. And as it walked along, it began to nose its way from side to side as if it were trying to avoid things unseen.
The dead sea, the spirits of those who once lived and walk among the living again.
And on they went. And she saw that there was a third calf that was doing very poorly. This poor calf, she took that skull and she took her finger. She put her finger inside that eye socket and she got some of the brie on her finger and she let that, now don't you lick my finger either. But she let that calf just have a little taste of that brie. And when that calf did it, it stood up, it shivered, it shook something off.
The dead sea, what feeds on the flesh of these cows, and how to get rid of it.
She saw that calf bound and leap across that field. She took that skull and she fed each of her cows that death brie. And as she did, she watched all of them be cured. And when she had treated all of those cattle in her herd, she took that skull, she took a flask, and she filled that flask up with the rest of that death brie. And as she did, and stowed away that flask, she saw that she could see the skull quite plainly. And then she worried, because she knew why she could see that skull quite plainly. The sun was starting to come up. Fly, girl, fly! And so she ran. She started to run. And she ran and she ran and she saw the vicarage. She saw her friend starting to come out of the vicarage. But as soon as her friend saw the skull in her hand, that friend, she keeled over again and fainted. And the vicar was distracted taking care of that friend, and that was good, because otherwise he would have seen her with the skull. And on she ran past the kirk, and she ran past where she saw where the gate was, and there was nothing in front of the gate now. And so she went through that gate, and on she ran, and she heard, fly, girl, fly! And so she ran, but as she was running, she wasn't watching where she was going, and she tripped over the root, and as she tripped, that skull came out of her hands, and it began to roll and bounce and bounce and twirl. And as it did, it bounced closer to where that hole was, and it fell down into that hole, and it hit and landed on that first head. Bonk,
Sorry, grandson.
and on it bonked, and it landed. Bonk,
Sorry, son.
and on it went until it came down right on its own bony shoulders, right into place and settled in. And the girl, she ran over to that hole in the ground. She leaned over to make sure the skull had been reunited with its body, and with its last breath, that skull opened up its jaw and it said,
Quick, girl, before the cock crows a third time, take some of the brie for yourself.
And so she took out that flask, not thinking, just doing what the skull had said, and she took some, and as she did, the cock crowed a third time. Sounded a lot like a donkey. And those bones, they shivered, and they shook, and they were still. And the bones of each of those bodies spoke no more. And she filled in the rest of that hole. And then she went to see her friend at the vicarage, and the friend was just coming out in a daze, and she couldn't remember anything that had happened that night. And that was so much the better, but the woman told her she could cure the cows in. The woman didn't know how, but the friend, she didn't know how, but she took that flask, the woman did, and she fed each of those cows in the whole village, and each was cured, and she became known throughout that whole area as a healer of great skill. And while she took that brie that didn't, after that night, have the same potency that it had had that night that she had woken the dead. Because she had tasted it that night, she could see as death sees. She could see the spirits of those who speak and walk among the living. She could see the evil that sometimes settles on towns and feeds on the flesh of the living, and she knew how to cure it. And she could see as death sees how precious every breath the living do take is. And that is the story from Scotland of the death breed. As a brief coda to the story, those of you who have been here more than once might have known a woman named Billy Moore. It's in honor of Billy that I tell that story. Billy, over 40 years ago, went to Scotland. She walked up and down the Wynd, the streets, the narrow passageways that connect the main streets with tall tenement buildings on either side. She would have heard stories like that told by the storytellers there on those Wynds. She also would have heard the true stories of the people in the early 1800s when Edinburgh was a center of anatomical study. She would have heard the true stories about people who would dig up dead bodies and would take them to the centers of anatomy and knock on the back door. And the doctors didn't ask where the bodies came from. So the resurrection men would dig up the bodies and sell them to the doctors. And I'm sure that's where we get these folk tales. Billy went to one of those storytelling events many years ago. And she came back here and she said, wouldn't it be nice if we had a festival like that in our hometown? And so Witches' Wynd began many years ago. Billy passed away this year. And while we may not be able to see as those who tasted the death brie that night might be able to see as death sees, I am 100% certain that Billy's spirit is here. And though we may not see her tonight, give her a wave, because she most certainly is here. Thank you, Billy. Thank you all.
Was she the one tormenting the donkey to make it make noise?
She and I will say that's the most that donkey has spoken in the past 2 days. So you might actually pay attention. You might actually see her.